Immigration's always been an issue that inflames passions. That's not surprising. You know, there are few things that are more important to us as a society than who gets to come here and call our country home.
Lady Liberty with her book of recipes and the finest one she's got is the great American melting pot, the great American melting pot.
Unless you're one of the first Americans, a Native American, you came from someplace else. Somebody brought you. The Irish, who left behind a land of famine. The Germans, who fled persecution. The Scandinavians, who arrived eager to pioneer out west. The Polish, the Russians, the Italians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the West Indians, the huddled masses who came through Ellis Island on one coast and Angel Island on the other. You know,
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to be discussing the topic of should Muslims stand out. The background on this is a couple of things that I've been reading lately online. The federal government that announced that there's a lot of the refugees, they're going to increase the number of refugees they're accepting from Syria, so I guess it's going to be 15,000 in 2016, and then they're going to be up to 30,000 in 2017. A lot of those refugees from Syria are going to be resettled most likely in the area where I live, which is southeastern Michigan. Probably a lot of them are going to come to Dearborn. Despite the fact that these refugees, they're going to be Muslim, and the language that they speak is obviously Arabic, which is a very common language here, at least as a second language. The situation they're going to be coming from in regards to the culture, the politics, and especially, you know, the situation with the war and everything else, it's going to be a very different kind of environment or culture, even though the religion and the language are similar to a lot of the communities that are here in Dearborn already. The other thing that I read that kind of got me going on this was Sayyid Hassan Kazwini. He's going to actually form a new mosque, and the mosque is going to, according to the article that I read in the Detroit Free Press, it's going to focus on youth education and preparing the youth to become leaders in the community. And one of the things he said in the article was interesting, which was that if we don't reach out to our youth, we're going to run one of two risks. Either the youth will be assimilated in the larger society and they won't identify with Islam anymore, or the other risk is that radicalization or extremism. It's interesting because when I was doing some research on this, I actually came across President Obama. I don't remember exactly where it was, but he said that Muslims in the U.S. are less likely than Muslims in Europe to become radicalized because they are more integrated or more assimilated into American society. I guess it's true in a sense, but that's kind of something that we're going to talk about. So that's kind of just a little background what got me interested in the topic. What we're going to talk about is, first of all, what does assimilation mean? What does it mean for Muslims, specifically for the Muslim community, to be assimilated? Is assimilation good or bad? Spoiler alert, it's not that simple of a question, but we're going to ask that question. So we want to talk first about what we mean by assimilation. It's kind of a broad term in English. So for our purposes, assimilation means that a minority group within the society over time comes to more closely resemble the majority group. Cultural assimilation is mostly concerned with the visible or the apparent features of a minority group, not the things that people actually believe or say they believe. It's more concerned with what language do you speak, how do you dress, what type of food do you eat, how do you behave in public, how do you behave in society. There's two major theories. The first one, or the classic assimilation theory, is called the melting pot theory. That's what it's commonly known as. Melting pot theory was developed in 1908. And it was developed to address the issue of mostly European Christian immigrants who came from primarily Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe. There were some Eastern Europeans. So we're talking about Irish, Scottish, obviously Poles, Czechs, Germans, Italians, French. the Europeans, who their societies were primarily Christian, and they were very much similar to the U.S. majority culture. So, and actually my mother's side, we were primarily German. On my father's side, it was Scottish and German. When I was growing up, I didn't really have any connection with Scottish culture, very little connection with German. The melting pot theory predicts that minorities will lose their cultural distinctiveness over time and be absorbed into the majority culture, which was pretty much true in the case of my family. There are many problems with this theory just because it really only applies to a certain group of minorities that came at a certain time in American history. And if you try to apply it to and it doesn't even apply to all of the groups that came to America during the early part of the history of this country. The more modern theory associated with something called multiculturalism, which kind of started in the 1960s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and it had a lot to do with the civil rights movement that happened at that time. It's commonly known as the salad bowl assimilation theory, and it basically predicts that minorities will still retain much of their cultural distinctiveness over time. So the minority groups that come to the United States, or they will retain a lot of their distinctiveness. It also acknowledges the reality that the majority culture is not static, and that changes over time as well in response to the minority cultures that come to the United States or that exist in the United States. And actually it encourages minority groups not to simply just melt into the majority culture, but to actually express themselves and to help to redefine what the majority culture is. Both of these theories have problems. I don't necessarily agree with either one of these theories totally. Just a couple of quick things about them. Neither one of these theories really consider the individual minority communities that talking about. They're very overly broad in general. They also don't distinguish between forced and voluntary assimilation. So there's, the two groups that come to mind with regard to forced assimilation, Native Americans and African Americans in this country didn't really have a choice. Nobody asked them if they wanted to assimilate or not and how they wanted to assimilate. They were kind of forced to assimilate, especially African Americans. They were literally, most of the African Americans in the United States, their ancestors were slaves, and they were forced to adopt the majority culture, and literally forced to adopt it. Native Americans also, there was, where I grew up in California, they still have the mission system where they took Native American children, and basically there was this idea, the slogan was kill the Indian, save the man, or something like that, basically, that said that we have to purge the native culture of the Native Americans from them in order to save their souls, and that was forced upon them. They didn't do that voluntarily. Other immigrant communities, for example, the Mexicans, they do assimilate, but they're assimilating not because they love or appreciate the culture of the United States. They're doing it simply for economic reasons, simply for survival reasons. The theories distinguish between cultural and religious assimilation. So if the immigrant group that we're talking about are Christians, which is the majority of the people in the United States are Christians, then there's really no issue of religious assimilation because both groups are Christian. Now, there's difference in denominations, obviously, within Christianity, but broadly speaking, there's no really issue of religious assimilation. It's more cultural, but when we're talking about, for example, Muslims, then you're talking about two issues, both cultural and religious assimilation, and those are two different issues, which we'll see shortly. And some immigrant communities make a clear distinction between culture and religion, and some of them don't. So, for example, the Jewish communities in the United States, in Judaism, there is no clear distinction between what is culture and what is religion. So that's even more complicated to determine whether or not you can apply this theory to them. The main question that we're going to get to in this discussion is whether assimilation is good or bad for Muslims in general. In other words, in what ways are Muslims changing, adapting to the overall culture, and in what ways are Muslims standing out from the majority culture? And in the ways that they're adapting, is that good? Is that positive or negative for the community? And in the ways that they're not assimilating or they're standing out from the majority culture, is that positive or negative? So that's the main issue that we're going to get into. In regards to assimilation of the Muslim community in the United States, we're not really going to discuss this in any kind of detail, but it should be said, just mentioned, there is a big difference when we're talking about post 9/11 or pre 9/11 in regards to assimilation. After 9/11 happened, a lot of things changed in regards to assimilation in the Muslim community in the United States. In other words, there was a lot of fear, and I definitely lived through that, especially the few years after it. There was a lot of fear in the Muslim community that if you did distinguish yourself, or that if you did stand out, that you would be target violent attacks, and you could even possibly be killed, or your family members could be killed if you were clearly associated with Islam. So there was unfortunately a lot of Muslims that kind of went underground immediately after 9/11, specifically because they were afraid for their life, they were afraid for their family, and that was unfortunate. Some of that is going away a little bit, but we're not really going to focus on that, but it should be mentioned. So in regards to, I guess, the positive case for assimilation definitely has some positive aspects for the Muslim community in regards to, for example, most Muslims in the United States speak English. So most Muslims, whether they're immigrants, which the majority of Muslims in the United States currently, either their parents were immigrants or they're immigrants from a Muslim country, but however, the majority of Muslims in the United States still speak English, which means that in regards to language, the Muslims have quickly assimilated, which is obviously good. In general, Muslims in the United States do not self-segregate. You don't generally see Muslims living in ghettos or enclaves set apart from the society. Now in Dearborn, because it's the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States, and also because of the history of when the Muslims originally came here, to some extent, I guess you could say in Dearborn, you do have large areas of the city that are primarily Muslim, but that's kind of an anomaly in the United States. Muslims also have higher levels of education and income, non-Muslims. So in regards to educational attainment, bachelor's degree, it's actually higher than the majority, higher than average. The number of mosques in the United States actually has increased. There's been a 74% increase just in the decade from 2000 to 2010. It increased. There was 1,209 mosques in the United States in the year 2000. In the year 2010, there was 2,106, and I'm sure that now there's probably a lot more than that. You see articles about new mosques being built all the time. Islam is also the fastest growing religion in the United States, and the important thing to say about that is that it's partly because of very high retention rates of Muslims when compared to other religious minorities, such as, for example, the Jewish community. There's a much larger percentage of Muslims that retain their identity as Muslims into the third, fourth, etc. generations when they had, for example, parents that immigrated from a majority Muslim country or majority Muslim society. Coming to the negative aspects of assimilation, there's basically two types of scenarios. One of them has to do with the children of Muslims that immigrate from majority Muslim countries, and the other one has to do with reverts. So we want to take those two separately. Some first-generation Muslims are rejecting some Islamic norms and behaviors to fit in with the majority of culture. So you see that in Dearborn. As an example, the hijab is a lot of times not being worn properly. Sometimes there's inappropriate behavior between young men and women. Listening to music and watching TV or movies that glorify sinful behavior. You hear inappropriate music being listened to, and you hear kids, young Muslim youth, and adults, it's not only youth, talking about TV shows or movies that they watch, and some of them are really not appropriate for Muslims. The regular daily prayers and fasting in some cases are either being abandoned, and it's unfortunate when that happens, of course, but in some cases it's just that they're delaying their prayers or their fasting because it conflicts with their work or their school schedule. So people are saying, well, they don't give me a place to pray at work, or I can't fast because I have a final, or other kinds of excuses. You have almost the opposite problem, interestingly enough, when it comes to reverts. And what I mean by reverts specifically in this case is people who were born and raised in this culture, in the majority culture in this country, that become Muslim usually at a later time, so not when they're children, so when they're young adults, or when they're adults, or when they're older adults. So they revert to Islam, or the common word is they're converts to Islam. You actually find something like reverse assimilation, where what I mean by reverse assimilation is that they're members of the majority culture. However, they adopt a lot of the cultural and traditions of the non-majority culture just to fit in, because you see that Muslims in the United States generally are pretty segregated. Unfortunately, that's true. So you have the Iraqi mosque, you have the Lebanese mosque, you have the Syrian mosque, you have the Egyptian mosque. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of mixing. You have the Iranian mosque. So when people become Muslim, a lot of times they are sort of adopted by a certain community, an ethnic community or cultural community that are also Muslim, but they also come from a very specific country. So the revert, to fit in with that culture, will adopt a lot of the cultural traditions of that minority culture, even though they are part of the majority culture. And this is not necessarily bad as long as this doesn't conflict with their religion. The reverse assimilation only becomes bad when you're either not aware of it a lot of times that you're doing it, or that you are breaking doing some things that Islam does not recommend just to fit in with the minority culture. For example, the aspect of self-segregation is negative. Even if you feel more comfortable with going to the mosque, the Lebanese mosque, you shouldn't limit yourself to only going to that mosque. You shouldn't limit yourself only to interacting with Muslims who come from a certain part of the world or from a certain very specific culture within Islam. You should always remain open to interacting and having relationships with all Muslims from all communities, regardless of how you were introduced or how you feel comfortable. You shouldn't cut off your relationships with your non-Muslim family members, especially family members, but even to some extent friends. So those friends that you had before you became Muslim, unless those friends are hostile to you, shouldn't cut off your relationships with them just because it feels uncomfortable because I'm a Muslim now and a lot of things that I used to do with my friends I can't do. So just tell them, well, I want to be friends with you, but I can't go to the bar and drink with you. I can't go to the club with you, but I would definitely like to continue to have a relationship with you, most especially with family members. So if you're from a non-Muslim family, your mother, your father especially, you cannot in Islam break off your relationship with them. Your brothers, sisters, cousins, it's extremely important to try to keep those relationships going. And of course, especially, unfortunately, as we've seen, there's some reverts that even go even further, and they basically they adopt causes that have to do with conflicts that are going on in other countries. And unfortunately, of course, we've seen that some of them even go and fight in other countries because they feel like it's their Muslim duty, etc., etc., etc. I mean, that's ridiculous. So again, talking about is Muslim assimilation good or bad, Islam is not merely a faith, but it's a way of life. The dominant culture's view of religion is that Protestant Christianity's view of religion is that it's a belief system and that people are being saved from eternal damnation by belief. This is the typical Protestant Christian refrain is you're saved by being baptized and your belief in Jesus as God. This is the typical Protestant Christian, and that's what saves you, and that's the primary purpose of religion. It's a belief system. Yes, they pray. Yes, they go to church. However, that's not the main point of it. The main point of it is salvation in the next life, etc. This is a majority culture view of religion, but it's very different than what Islam sees as the point and the purpose of religion. As Muslims know, Islam is a deen or a path. It's a way of life. Both the beliefs and the practices are necessary for your success, both in this life and in the next life, and they're self-reinforcing. If you don't practice the religion, then your belief in the religion will also go down. So you have to have both things in order to be successful. Many of the practices of Islam required on a daily basis, so the 5 daily prayers, the fasting during Ramadan, it's a daily participation in the way of life of Islam, and that's extremely important. And Muslims must maintain that view of religion and not adopt the view of the majority culture, which is that it just has to do with what you believe. In regards to the question again of assimilation is good or bad for Muslims, if the required practices of Islam are seen as irrelevant to the faith of Islam, then this will eventually change one's faith or weaken one's faith. If the wajib is abandoned, or if you start practicing things that are haram, of course that's bad, and that's going to weaken your faith, and eventually it will change your faith over time. If the religion is expanded to include beliefs and practices that are not part of Islam, then this will lead to unnecessary and harmful isolation from the society and eventually lead to overt hostility and extremism. So again, going back to the kind of the last slide, or I think it's the last slide on the issue of whether assimilation is good or bad. In many ways, Muslims in the United States are well assimilated in regards to language, in regards to education. 1/4 of Muslims hold bachelor's degrees or higher, which is higher than average. Average income for household income, $75,000 per year or more, which is higher than average. And in general, Muslims reject all forms of extremism, which is good. Also, we should talk about also in terms of the society. In general, the things that Islam calls for are good for both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Society doesn't benefit by Muslims doing things that are haram, and by Muslims doing their wajib actions, the society benefits. So the practice of Islam is actually good for both the Muslim and for the majority culture and the majority society as a whole. So the final question that we address is, how do we prevent the negative aspects of assimilation? One of the main things that are needed for Muslims to avoid the negative aspects of assimilation is that we need to be knowledgeable about what is wajib and what is haram. So what is required, what does your faith require of you, and what does the faith not allow you to do? So what must you do, and what things you cannot do. It's very important to understand that and to educate yourself on that, and to have the courage to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala despite the sometimes disapproval of the majority culture. So if you have to pray, you have to pray. If you can't find a place at work that's totally private and you have to pray, it's possible somebody may walk by and they may see you praying. That takes courage, because the person, of course, is going to maybe try to interrupt you during the prayer. They're going to ask, hey, so what are you doing? There's going to be some awkward moments, awkward questions. They're going to, during Ramadan, your friends are inviting you to lunch. You can't go to lunch because you're fasting, or your teacher schedules the final at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a day that you're fasting, or God forbid the day after one of the Laylat al-Qadrs, where you've stayed up all night and then you have a final in the morning because they're not aware of the fact that it's Ramadan. Those things are difficult, but that's one of the things that builds character. So it's really important that we follow our religion despite the difficulties. We also need much more bridge building between the mosques, Islamic centers, and the majority cultures. We shouldn't be using the mosque as a refuge or a place to hide from the communities that we live in. We have to embrace those discussions that take place, whether it's within the mosque or outside of the mosque, with non-Muslims about our faith. We have to invite them into our Islamic centers. We have to go to their churches, go to their synagogues, go to the places where they worship, build the bridges between our communities. And finally, we need knowledgeable leaders and guides to educate and inspire their communities with regards to the beliefs and practices of their faith. This is one of the things I think that's missing the most in our communities. Although we have good leaders, we have leaders that are able to do the job, we just need better and maybe even higher caliber of leaders that we have that really understand the challenges that Muslims face in this country, and they're really able to address those and kind of inspire people to go to the next level. And again, this is not a slight against the excellent Muslim leaders that we have currently. There's many, many excellent ones. We just need more of the really good ones. We need more of them. And then for the ones that are kind of not so great, we need them to either improve their leadership abilities, or we need new leaders. In conclusion, it can properly be said that Muslim Americans are, generally speaking, assimilated in some ways that are positive. However, there's some aspects of assimilation that are negative, and they must be avoided. And it's important for Muslims to be true to their way of life while also adapting to their societies in which they live, while, of course, maintaining their religion, and especially in regards to the wajib and haram. Assalamu alaikum.